Thank you so much, Heidi, for the invitation to be part of this event. It is a great pleasure for me to discuss the work of two great colleagues and scholars. So today we'll be talking about, with the authors of two great works of scholarship on some of the most important issues of our current moment. And the second book is Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production and Network Building in China-Africa Relations by Lina Benabdallah, who is Assistant Professor at Wake Forest University and Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Africa Program. As we will find out in just a moment, these two books are very different from each other, and yet at the very least, they share the idea that discursive and narrative factors are at least equally important as material capabilities are in understanding China and rising powers and their relations with the world.
Thank you so much, Ilaria. And thank you, Heidi, for this wonderful invitation. I'm very happy to be able to join in this fantastic panel and present some of the arguments of my book and benefit from this discussion and get to know a bit more about the work that Manjari is doing here. So I also wanted to celebrate just, with you the derailed plans. I really do think that without all those travel plans, I don't know if I would have a book. So it's definitely a privilege, and it's something that needs to be at least acknowledged very briefly here. So the book, sharing my screen here. Here we go. So this book is basically the product of my doctoral dissertation. I have worked on it for several years. I've done a lot of field work to examine these questions of power relations. And like I said, I benefited a lot from a lot of travel for field work and a lot of interviews, a lot of observations, and things that seem so far away today, but I'm very thankful for the opportunity today to just share this platform and talk a little bit more about it. So my book, the questions that I examined dovetail really nicely with, for today's conversation, with why nations rise. And that is because the main questions that I ask in the book have to do very much with the questions of how do rising powers rise exactly. We talk about China as a rising power. What does that mean, right? When we say it's a rise in power, what does it do to rise in power? So what are the mechanisms of power projection, power building that we see in rising powers? For me, particularly, I focused on the global South, and the conversations I enter in my book are conversations that are more related to international relations theories that really deal with great power politics and the concept of power in international politics, power projections, and how, in a lot of mainstream or what can be called traditional IR theories, there is a particular, almost sort of a linear narrative about how powers become great powers. And my question here is, can we assume that those narratives that we know about from international relations theories, do they apply to all kinds of powers? Can we automatically take those frameworks of international power politics and apply it and use it to understand powers rising from the global South? And so, I mean, just to give a very small and very quick clue here, I mean, the answer is no, right? The answer, that the whole argument of the book is that we cannot go ahead and assume that we can rely on the same theories of international relations that speak about power internationally and use them to understand a very different context when it comes to South-South relations or when it comes to global South power politics. And so the endeavor that I take in the book is to examine the case of the dynamics of China's foreign policy making in Africa and see what can we learn from looking at this particular dynamics. What can we learn about the formations of powers, rising powers, great powers from the global South, right? Is there a teleological story there about how powers accumulate a certain amount or number of, or a threshold of material power, and then they move on and they become sort of these great powers. How does that exactly work? And I say that this dovetails really nicely with the book that Manjari just presented on, is because in her book, you've heard the presentation. I mean, it is all about the differences, and it's all about the nuances, and it's all about these complexities. When we're talking about rising powers, to basically open up that box of rising powers and deconstruct what we use as shorthand to speak about these powers. So how do they rise differently? So we have, they have this active rising powers, the reticent rising powers, and a lot of categories there. So I think that there are a lot of similarities, in approaching this question in international relations to, in a way, really, for me, it's to decenter theories of international relations that take for granted these concepts that, such as, international power politics. And so when I was working on my book, I was not able to find in international relations theories a framework that was satisfying to me in terms of explaining what I had noticed and had observed and done in terms of fieldwork, and in terms of what I was interested in, the China-Africa relations. And of course, China-Africa relations, and it's just sort of a very expansive, very comprehensive story there. I'm not going to talk all about it, but the part that was interesting to me was that it wasn't necessarily the material investments of China in Africa, meaning it wasn't really details about infrastructure projects that the Chinese actors, companies, enterprises, and government were building in Africa. It wasn't really the ports or the airports or the natural resources infrastructure that was attractive to me. What was really attractive to me about the story of China and China's the power dynamic in the China-Africa relations came from examining something completely different, which is a story of looking at the connective tissue that I noticed as I was doing fieldwork, and then I was reading about the China-Africa relations, and the connective tissue. A lot of it had to do with what I talk about as human capital investments. And so this isn't natural resources investment, this isn't material power investments, but it's human capital investment. And a lot of this human capital investment, a lot of it is actually about the narrative, which is again another connection to make with Manjari's excellent book, is that Africa really presents a case of where we see China's narrative about a great power to be. We see in the China-Africa relations, we really do see this dynamic, active narrative making. And I think that that's really interesting. And so for my own research, I had decided that I wanted to get my own theoretical framework. And so I went ahead and basically built scaffolding, using scaffolding, built a research, a theoretical framework that included these three elements that were really essential to the observations that I had made with my fieldwork. And so these points include network building, not knowledge production, and norm diffusion. And when we talk about human capital, we talk about, or human capital investments, we're talking about opportunities for Chinese elites, government officials, military people, journalists, students, engineers, medical staff, opportunities to get them to interact with their African counterparts, whether it's through formalized meetings. A lot of you might be familiar with the FOCAC, which is the Forum on China-Africa Relations. It's this sort of forum summit that has become a very emblematic of the China-Africa relations. And it actually boasts a lot of these points because it's a platform where elites from all parties come together, and I'm interested in the report, what's going on, how that shapes the relationship, how creating a foreign policy based around this connective tissue, this social capital, this human capital. How does that get, talked about, or how do we frame it? How do we understand it in terms of theoretical frameworks within international relations? And so to me, these three elements were really important. So knowledge production is important because these platforms that I'm talking about, to get these elites or to get groups together to discuss or to have trainings, they result in a lot of knowledge production. So there are a lot of summits, a lot of exchange programs, a lot of joint research programs. And so that's a very important element. And then norm diffusion here becomes really important when these opportunities for exchanges become routinized, they become institutionalized. And so when there's a certain routine to it, then there's an action plan, and then there's an agenda, and then there's a committee that implements the agenda, and a committee that oversees the implementation of whatever agenda points were agreed upon. And so it becomes, there's a norm making, norm diffusion element to all of this. And so the framework that I ended up with is this sort of tripartite framework of analysis that puts a premium not on material aspects of rising powers. So this isn't examining China's military bases in Africa. This isn't examining China's number of ports or airports or infrastructure projects, but it's really looking at layers of networks that are spun between African and Chinese elites, government officials, party politicians, military high-ranking officials, etc. And so this is the interest I had here. And in order to work on this framework, I had relied on a lot of scholars' work, some in international relations and some not. But basically, the seminal work, a lot as it, Gifts, Favors, and Banquets by Mayfair Yang, 1994 book that basically is a study of the art of guanxi, essentially social relations, banqueting. So the art of guanxi here, as a quick quote from the book, guanxi place an emphasis on the binding power and emotional and ethical qualities of the personal relationships. And so a lot of this is about understanding the personal connections, the power of those interactions and the connections, the network building that occurs during when we look at the China-Africa relation, again, from this perspective of connective tissue, from this perspective of exchange programs, professionalization trainings, and all these training opportunities and summit opportunities that invite Africans to China, invite Chinese to Africa in order to interact with between elites and etc. And so it's all about this personal relationship, and Mayfair Yang's book does an excellent job really detailing all the different aspects of guanxi, mostly within domestic society perspective. And then I pair that up with Qin Yaqing's a seminal book on a relational theory of world politics. In many ways, this is taking the concept of guanxi and basically applying it to international relations or to world politics, and so that was very important. And then, of course, there were other parts of the argument that came from looking at other scholarships as well. But these were basically the main books that I wanted to refer to here as I explained my theoretical framework. And so when we talk about human capital investments in China-Africa relations, like I said, it's not the most visible aspect of the relations. If you do a Google search very quickly about China and Africa, chances you're going to find, things like Addis Ababa, headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa, or you'll find the Mombasa to Nairobi railway, or you'll find images of stadiums or images of different infrastructure projects, we don't necessarily hear a whole lot or see a whole lot about this other aspect of China-Africa relations, which is about human capital and what's going on in terms of these exchanges and these personal relationships that are spun between Chinese and Africans of all different sort of professions and walks of life, etc. And so that's really my focus. But to give you a quick quote here by Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi, this was just from October, just sort of given a rundown of the numbers of scholarships that the Chinese government has offered to Africans, the numbers of Confucius Institutes, the numbers of exchanges between doctors, the patients, these sort of the sister cities, and this expands to journalists, to military, to other aspects that are not captured in this quote. But this is just to give you an idea of the what we see and what I mean by human capital and what I analyze and what I'm interested in examining in under this big category of human capital investments. We are sometimes perhaps in the last maybe few months to years because sort of in the US and US-China relations have centered a bit on looking at what China is doing in Africa. Maybe you might be familiar a bit with images or like numbers like this, numbers that show up here about international students in Chinese institutions. And so by now we've heard the argument made several times that that Chinese institutions have become the top destination for African students, especially African students from Anglophone African countries. And so there's that sort of, from that sense of competition, we start hearing about this, that a lot of African students are choosing to go to China for education. And this gives you a very quick idea in 2003 what the numbers were like. You see here 1,793 African students in China, a small number, right? A very small group. And then, by 2018, we're looking at 81,562 African students in China. And so, here the questions will be sort of, what is the impact of this investment, right? So we know and see and hear a lot about that trap diplomacy. We see and hear a lot about the impact of investments by Chinese enterprises in Africa when it comes to infrastructure projects. But then the question is, that what do we know? What is the impact? What's the interest and role of investing in human capital, in the China-Africa relations here? And so the cases that I look at in the book, besides this aspect of students and higher education exchanges, are military diplomacy and security trainings. And here, in this case, I look at the China-Africa Security Forum, for example, which is a forum that brings together high-ranking military officials from all African countries and their Chinese counterparts. The last time that this summit happened, this forum happened, it took place in Beijing, and it took place over 2 weeks. And over those 2 weeks, there's a lot of seminars and talks and, of course, narratives. But there's also really the practice aspect of these narratives, meaning there is a part and embedded in these trainings and in this forum, for example, that I gave an example about. Embedded in these are trips, catered tours of different agencies in China, that have the goal of sort of showcasing the development model of China and trying to sort of present that as an alternative that works, to showcase to Africans that they can, think and work with China as a very serious partner. And so there's a whole lot of aspects going on here. There's obviously the networking aspect, which is the getting together of high-ranking officials of the militaries from different countries. There's also the social, sort of the knowledge production aspect of it, which is to say, sharing during seminars, information about the different techniques and the different philosophies and different ways of thinking about what is a security, what's security threat, how to respond to security threats, and sort of all of these. And then connected to that is the norm diffusion aspect, which comes with, sending delegations to China for training, for example. On what basis do they do the training? What kind of norms shape these trainings? What is the civil military report? What is the government to media sort of report if we're thinking about a different context? But all of these questions I try to capture in thinking about not just sort of the discourse as we see it, so how is China presenting itself to Africans on paper, but also in practice when we have delegations and different people-to-people exchange programs interact, what is the outcome of those interactions? And so the second case is public diplomacy. I had already talked a little bit about this. So the trainings for journalists, and it goes without saying, of course, journalists are the writers of narratives. They basically are going to portray the, if it's China-Africa relations. And so influencing that or shaping those narratives is very important, or producing, co-producing those narratives is very important. And so I examined that in one of the cases. And then the last case I had already mentioned a bit, this cultural diplomacy, the aspect of whether it's African students going to China for training or the Confucius Institute. So the expanding Confucius Institutes, we all know, for the audience members who are familiar with the case of the US, the trend over the last few years has been to sort of shut down Confucius Institutes from different American higher education institutions, whereas in Africa, we know that the trend is quite the opposite. We have an increasing trend of the openings of Confucius institutes. And here I examined what does a Confucius Institute do. So I looked at the Addis Ababa University Confucius Institute to see what all goes on in this. When you have a Confucius Institute, what does the Confucius Institute do? And the answer is a lot of it is network building, is connecting Chinese companies that are in Addis Ababa with students who are interested in working, with getting students from Addis Ababa University who are interested in Chinese language to go to China for more language immersion. And then when they come back, they get hired by Chinese companies. There's a lot of network building going on in these Confucius Institutes. And the idea is that if we stop the work at counting how many Confucius Institutes, we would miss out on a whole lot of things going on in the China-Africa relations, because then we don't open up that box to ask the question, what is going on in the Confucius Institute? And then when we do, we actually understand that there's a different way that China is present in Africa. And this different way is this interpersonal relations, is this building the social capital, this connective tissue that I think is very very important. And so between these three cases, I essentially, like I said, the argument is to come back and say, at the end of the day, without looking at these, what goes on during these trainings, during these thousands of scholarships that I shared in the quote earlier, during all these trainings, and we know that African governments send delegations to China for training, whether it's from their police academies or their different branches of the military, or journalists who work for public media, or engineers, agriculture. I've just covered 3 cases, but I could have covered 20 because there are so many different things that go on in this. And so this was just a very quick sample. But what comes back at the end of this is then we have a whole group of generations of African public officials who either are very familiar with China because they went on these trainings, or they are at some point, if they had their education in China, so they are familiar with the language, they're familiar with the culture, they're familiar with how business is conducted with China. And so there are other dividends to investing in human capital, although perhaps we don't see these dividends right away. Perhaps these are more or less medium to long term return of investments than we would when we're examining the infrastructure projects and the other aspects of China's foreign policy in making in Africa. But to conclude, when we zoom out of this context, what I wanted to take away from this is that the idea here is that we should not assume that all powers rise in the same way, and we should not assume that and even if we're looking at the same period of time, for example, that there should be a more careful and more complex, more nuanced way of really understanding what matters in these relationships and what matters in this foreign policy making, instead of assuming the all end all be all is, a particular way that we've examined countries from majority global north rise to power and then take that and apply it basically everywhere else in the world. Yeah, and so I'll turn it over to Ilaria for the Q&A. Thank you.